Alright, today we talked about experiments in science, and most people when they walk in the door, when they picture science, they picture that of a scientist, running the test tubes and doing controlled experiments. Most of when people consider scientific thinking, they think of setting up a fair or balanced or controlled experiment. And so the way we define experiment is a test to see how a variable affects a result. And we noted that we try to control everything else. One thing that the students did is that they gave them two cleaning products and said, I had them come up with an explanation or an experiment that would test which of these is more effective at cleaning windows. And most of the students very easily came up with a way to do that. Some of them use the same window, some use different windows, but they also made sure that the mess was about the same size. They started out being about the same dirtiness, things like that. And so they did control a lot of the variables. But then we noted that what we did with the tubes, when we were investigating the tubes, that was not an experiment. And the reason that was not an experiment is because we couldn't control variables. There was no variable for us to change. There was no variable for us to manipulate. We weren't taking two of the tubes and doing one thing to one and another thing to another. And so because of that lack of control and no variable, the tubes is not considered an experiment. We did make models, but that's a different approach to the problem than setting up a controlled experiment where we have heavily controlled things except for one variable where we have decided it's going to be this way and then this way. And so it's a different approach to a scientific problem. And so what that led us to is that there's two types of science. There's observational science and experimental science. What's interesting is that most science is probably considered observational science. Observations that we are able to make are powerful, and we use those to inform our ideas. Of course, in experimental science, we also make observations, but we're doing it under controlled conditions where we are manipulating the variables, whereas here we're observing the variables. Next, back to the fact that there can't be a scientific method, because the approaches in the scientific method oftentimes talk about setting up an experiment where much of science has no experiments. From there, we kind of switched gears and we went over and talked about the role of bias in science. And we noted that all human beings are biased. Therefore, scientists have to be biased. We'd like to think that scientists can get rid of their bias or that they can be totally objective, but unfortunately that's just not the case. We can never really get rid of all the junk that we take with us to any problem-solving situation. And so we made a list of the cause of scientist bias. And of course our prior ideas, our former thinking, and as well as our schooling or our training is going to affect the kinds of ideas that we bring to the table, the kinds of ideas that we're willing to accept, and the kinds of ideas we want to reject. Other scientists influence scientists, and that kind of connects into reputations. If a scientist with a very strong reputation puts forth an idea, people are going to think more highly of it than if a scientist who doesn't have a strong reputation puts forth an idea. Pride, which is also related to personal reputation, like if I have an idea, I'm not going to want to give up on that idea because I want my idea to be the one that gets accepted. Of course, money and fame have corrupting powers, and then society and culture. We didn't get much into the society and culture issue and how it affects science, but it certainly is a factor that plays heavily into what kind of science is done, how much funding science gets, what kinds of questions get asked, how the scientist goes about answering those questions are all going to be influenced by the society and culture of the time, whether it's a society and culture that changes over years or if it's the location that causes the difference in society and culture.